conflicting. I remember this one commercial where it was like, when they attacked the twin. I don't think it was a commercial for anything. It was just, paid by whatever, some probably political person.
Capitalism.
Yeah, and it was like, when they attacked the Twin Towers, like they were trying to change America, and then like fades, and then it was because explosions the tower, which is like also fucked up that they show that shit in like commercial, and then it like fades away. And then it fades back, and they're like, and they did, and it was just a row of houses with American flags on it. I remember having very conflicting feelings of being like,
I remember that commercial.
Yeah, I remember being
like, what up, world?
Hey-o.
Welcome back to another tasty episode of the Ameri Podcast. It is Wednesday, 6:46 p.m. We got the original crew in the house, including Mr. Fluffy, Fluff on the Road. How you doing tonight, Fluffster?
Hello, doing good. Thank you for having me. I'm currently in Maryland, shortly to be in Pennsylvania.
Driving safely.
Yes, zero distractions.
This is
I'm gonna
important.
say, Fluff on the Road may be the best description I've ever heard of Nelson.
Even when he's not on a road trip.
That's true. You know what? That's like, that's good stuff.
Also,
I'm gonna have that made as a sticker.
You should, and I bet you'll get a lot of play in the porn industry.
Definitely put that on both sides. Get 2 stickers.
I like
using a hands-free device, of course. Of course.
Wearing a mask. No, all right, sorry. Anyways.
Also with us this evening is Mr. Tyler Grillo, our West Coast correspondent. How are you tonight?
Doing well. Glad to be back in the house with the crew. Feel like I haven't been the full house in a minute. So, yeah, good to be here. And also, for those of you on our visual medium, trying out what would I look like with a mullet. You
look really good, actually. I was
you.
thinking to myself, this whole intro, 2 things. 1, Kelly has a very impressive drum roll. And 2, your hair looks fantastic.
Thank you, Blake. And, coming from you means a lot. Means a lot.
Dear listeners, let us know if you think Tyler would look good in a mullet. If we get 5 likes, he's going to shave it. So
Yes, actually, totally. Let's go.
This is the best content we've ever put out on this audio medium, for sure.
Oh man, I don't know. That's bold. That's bold. Also with us out in Denver is John Anderson. How are you tonight?
Good. Fucking ready to podcast, baby.
Hell yeah. And John Kelly, also out in the Denver metro area. How are you this evening, sir?
Fantastic. Glad to be back. Glad to be getting another just upper topic to bring into your ears, dear listeners.
That's our brand.
On point. How are you, Blake?
Yeah. Oh, I'm good. Thank you for asking. I am sitting in a new chair I've got here. It's very comfortable. Fluffy sat in it before he hit the road. And I'm sipping on some Malbec.
Blocky Malbec, the original.
Yep.
Bringing it back around.
So I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here with you fellas. And despite the subject matter, it's important that we get it in before this month expires. We're going to talk a little 9/11 this evening and reflect on what we were going through that terrifying day 20 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just go ahead and say that it's crazy that it's already been 20 years. I mean, something to be such a strong influence on our domestic and foreign policy, and something that's had such a strong impact on kind of day-to-day lives for the majority of our being on the planet is pretty crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it deeply affected me on a personal level, and it set trajectories for me that continued to this day in part. So I was, primed for it, but it, at least for me personally, it was a very deterministic day in my life, which is wild to think now 20 years on.
Yeah.
The thing that I think about, I feel the same way, John. I also feel like it's interesting because there's so many people alive now that have no living memory of 9/11, right? Which is crazy to us. But at the same time, I feel like at least for me personally, I was probably just old enough, really, like by a year or two maybe, for it to have that kind of impact on my life.
Mm-hmm.
Because even when it happened, I knew that conceptually, I knew that it was a big deal because of everybody's reaction to it. But personally, it was on a scale that at that time I didn't understand.
Yeah, I knew enough to know that I didn't know how big a deal it was, basically. I was like, I'm aware of the fact that this is gigantic, but I am also aware of the fact that I can't really process it right now.
Yeah.
And still, I mean, like, we as a country, we're still processing it.
And all of us were like, what, 12, 13 years old, right? Yeah.
We're in 7th grade.
Yeah.
So, whatever that is.
Yeah, 11, 12, 13.
Yeah, but one of the first times I felt old in my 20s was when I was talking to people, or I guess maybe it was even before then, but when I was talking to people who didn't have a strong memory of it, and I was like, oh God, am I old? But Nelson, you make a good point that like we are one of the youngest age groups that could have clear memories of it, right? You get into 5, 4, 3rd grade and you start to be like, I kind of remember it, but like I have a very vague recollection of Columbine. Which we were in 3rd grade, I think, when that happened.
Oh yeah, that's much more vague in my mind, for sure.
Yeah, like I remember getting locked down, but that's about it. With 9/11, like I have pretty clear memories through the day, especially in the morning.
Yeah, me too.
And I think that that's important. That it was at a time that was formative for us. And millennials. We joke about this, our 7th world changing event in our lives, right? But it was such a big deal at such a formative moment that then sets the stage for so much that's happened globally, politically, but also domestically.
For sure.
And then with the subsequent things related to 9/11, but also unrelated to 9/11, climate change and all of the things, right? And all the things we've experienced. But I think experiencing something like that at such an early age sets a thing in your learning that it's not that it wouldn't be normal, but because we've experienced so many of them and we experienced it at such a young age, there's a familiarity about it, at least for me and other people I've talked, not in like a good way or like, oh, yay, this, but it's like this again, some big, huge, fucked up thing.
Nelson sent me a meme that I think captures this in a slightly different context where it's that meme where it's like the guy poking the stick and is like, do something, and it's the housing market and it's going up and up and up and up and up and it's labeled millennials and they're poking it and saying crash already. Because and I felt that so deeply because it's like, I'm just ready for like the next financial crisis. Let's go. Yeah. And so, I think it, and that's a big difference to, I mean, basically every generation since 1812, right? Is that our personal security, well, I guess Civil War too, whatever. But let's say after the World War II, Americans didn't have to worry about their personal security domestically. And we, at a young age, did not have that same kind of security.
Yeah, but it's a very good point. It's a very good point. After World War II, there was no real domestic threats. Yeah, sure, we fought wars, right? We had Korea. We had Vietnam, which was a disaster. We had the first Gulf War that we were all around for, but we don't remember because we were so young. Operation Desert Storm.
Mm-hmm.
But it is an entirely different beast when you look at it. And maybe I'll start off because I know we were going to talk about some personal stories from that day as the resident former New Yorker on the podcast. Because I was in New York the weekend just before 9/11 happened. Because 9/11 happened on Tuesday morning, if I remember correctly.
I believe you.
Well, yeah, because I went to my aunt's wedding and she was marrying a police officer who worked in downtown Manhattan. And had he not gotten married that weekend, he would have been one of the first responders. Wow. But he was on his honeymoon. He had flown out on Sunday night. And we flew back and I went to the Broncos Jets game the night before. And I woke up with my dad, the next morning after going to that game. And I remember standing in my living room, my dad was like, I thought this was not real 10 minutes ago, but I think it is. You need to watch this right now. This is a very big deal. And, it's the first time I had ever had my parents spoke to me that way, of like something happening on a television set, even though it was 3,000 miles away, and something that was tangentially connected to my family, since I knew people that were in New York. I had people that worked in Manhattan in my family still at that time. And at least in my household, it was a disaster. My parents thought that the country was under attack. Manhattan was going to be in flames by the end of the day. They didn't know if they should send me to school, if they should not go to work, any of that stuff. And that's at, let's see, that would have been 6:45, 7 o'clock in the morning here in Denver.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's just the start before we even got to school. And we were all in, middle school together at that point. And
Yep.
that was a stressful day at school too. But that's how the first couple of hours were, even before the second plane hit.
Yeah. I had a pretty similar experience in the morning. I used to, because I'm extremely cool, record Star Trek Voyager at night, which was after my bedtime, and then I'd watch it in the mornings before I went to school. Damn right, I figured out how to program the VCR. And so I remember turning on the television, because my mom, the television was of course set to CNN or whatever, and I saw the first tower on fire. And being a stupid seventh grader who'd never experienced something like that, I was like, some moron set a trash can on fire and I'm going to watch my Star Trek Voyager. And so I pop it in and my mom's like, hey, can you go back to that real quick? And from there, and then my next memory is being in the car with my mom. And we were listening to the radio, and it was the first time that I had heard the Pentagon be hit. And I remember my mom just being like, this is your innocence is gone, basically. Like, this is really, really bad, that kind of stuff. And then I got to school early enough where we had like 20 minutes or something like that, and we were sitting in the cafeteria like we usually did, and then we ran into Mr. McCarthy's first period biology class and turned on the television, and there was just a cloud over Manhattan. And from the time I'd left my house to the time we got to the television, the towers had fallen.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I can pick it up there, because I actually didn't learn about it till I got to school.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. And usually I took the bus, but I don't think I did that day for some reason. Maybe at that time my parents were working, my mom was working, because my mom was working close to there. Maybe that's why, I don't know. Because we had limited TV time in my house growing up, and the morning was definitely not a time for television. So like we didn't, and this is like before phones and shit. So like you haven't got like the paper or something, which is obviously not going to have an event that's unfolding at that moment. And I don't think I listened to the radio at all either. I think we just listened to music or something. So I didn't know until I got to school. And so I remember walking in that front of Evergreen Middle School with the staircase that goes up, and like a bit of a frenzy happening, like 10 or 15 people. And they were like, and I remember someone told me it was a helicopter crashed into the Pentagon. I remember like that was like the first thing I heard or something. It was like something that was like it was a helicopter crash into something, and obviously that didn't happen. But like just the amount of rumors that were circulating, like that was the first thing I heard.
Yeah.
And then I do remember
that too. I remember the conjecture.
Yeah. And then at some point that I think I connected with my parents, like I think they just like called the school and were like, can we just like, because my dad, oh that's right, because my dad was supposed to fly. My dad was supposed to fly that day. And so I remember actually in my heart level being like, he's fine, but being concerned, obviously. And so I think I called my mom or something. And then I remember going home, and my dad was he was wherever he was. So he was already gone for work. And so I got home with my mom. And again, I remember because I remember
Did she pull you out of school?
Do we have it? I think we ended early that day or something. I
think so.
I don't know.
I think we ended early.
I remember being at lunch and people started getting pulled out and stuff like that.
Yeah, possible.
But I know at least I made it to lunch for sure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then I remember a good amount of things. I mean, I want to hear from Nelson and Blake, but I also remember a good amount of things about like from the weeks and months following that. Like that day was impactful, but it feels like I remember it more of like a swarm of stuff. And then there are things going forward that I remember more clearly being like, oh, that moment, oh, that, like having thoughts about the world where I was like, oh, you know.
Right.
I did ride the bus to school that day, as I did most days. I'm pretty sure I did. Although my mother was also the clinic lady at the elementary school down the road, so I was usually at school early anyways. And I remember I was in the cafeteria hanging out with like Chris Lundquist and like Brendan Flanagan and shit. And we were just chilling, like probably talking about Counter-Strike and stuff, you know, video games. And then I remember I believe on the intercom, they had us go to our first period early from the cafeteria.
Oh.
And nobody knew why. And so we all went to our first period. Mine was, I think it was Miss Rainey, the English teacher.
Yeah, because you were 6'1", right? Or 7'1"?
Yeah.
Yeah, Rainey.
And she was super dope though. And she had the TVs on when we walked in. And like she was the teacher. Did you guys read the book That Was Then, This Is Now?
I don't remember. I probably didn't read it if it was assigned, so let's say that.
So it was an assigned book, and there's a couple characters, but like one of the main characters was this little black boy. I think his name was Eminem. And he was like, he just turned 13, grown up in Chicago, I think, and it took place in like the 60s or 70s. It was all about like youth entering adulthood and all of those experiences like sex, drugs, alcohol. It was a great book that we read in fucking seventh grade or whatever.
Wow.
And it was in her class, and I don't remember if it was before this happened or if it was after, like if it was for the assigned reading for the summer or whatever. But dude, I vividly remember walking into that class and seeing, I think there was one plan had already hit. And then we watched the second one hit on TV, and all this, we're like, oh, fuck.
Wow.
And then, the classes rolled through. I think maybe second period had more TV or more video footage of the news. And then I think I was in school the whole day.
I think they asked they asked the teachers to turn off the television too.
At a certain point.
At some point, yeah.
I remember an announcement. I think it was either second or third period where they announced it because kind of the majority of the action had happened at that point. But I remember at each subsequent period them turning it on at the beginning and then turning it off.
Okay.
To see if anything else was happening and then turning it off again. And
that must have been tough to be a teacher that day. Damn.
Oof.
Oh yeah. Totally.
Jeez, like,
what are you going to tell a bunch of seventh? Yeah. You know,
especially a bunch of seventh graders, like a bunch of white seventh graders that grew up in Evergreen.
Yeah. Well, like adults.
Well, and nobody knew what was happening.
Yeah,
they didn't know what was happening. They're just like, let's hope that this is just like an isolated incident, right?
Yeah.
So that was one of the most amazing things about that teacher and that class and that moment for me was that after reading that book, That Was Then, This Is Now, we had the class discussion. She was like, how many of you think that this is a true story? Like, this is like, could this happen in real life? And like class people raise their hands. How many people think it's like couldn't happen, you know? And people raise their hands. And her whole point was to like show us that that was reality and that Evergreen was very much a bubble. Mm-hmm. You know, it was a great experience. And then to have that happen too with the same teacher the same year was a very vivid experience for me.
Yeah, I had Mr. McCarthy that first period, like I said, and the only thing I remember about him was that he studied bugs, and then he told me to eat potatoes when you go backpacking because it'll make you warmer, which in retrospect was probably bad diet advice.
I remember I never even knew Mr. McCarthy, and then they like made me like kind of almost like a TA for him because I had like a free
Oh, I
period
remember
in 8th grade.
that.
And
That's
he
right.
used to make me carry a snake around, and I hated snakes.
Yeah,
and he'd
I
be like, "You got to
remember
take my
that.
snake out," and I'd be like, "I got to take your snake out? What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
Of course, somebody with the last name of McCarthy is gonna force you to eat a potato. Or
Yeah.
Still makes sense. This all checks out.
Whoa!
He used to
Throwing shade on Irish people here. Whoa!
Yeah, it's serious.
My last name's Manion. All right, I am very much Irish. I can do it.
I know, buddy.
Not people.
Hold on. Let me be the guardrails.
You don't want to talk about how we used to.
Accidentally, quote unquote. Yeah, I definitely haven't. Yeah. Anyways,
I'm gonna delete that one.
Yeah, that's probably something to edit out.
Yeah. I was gonna make a reference, but then I decided that was a bad idea too. For similar reasons. I also, it must have been a hard day just generally to be an adult, but also like a parent, because, so like for me, I remember I came home. That's why I like really first talked to my like mom about it. And then like maybe it was like later that day or like the next day, when my dad got home or something, we had been to New York and gone to that restaurant at the top of one of the Twin Towers like earlier that summer, June or July, I think. And so like we had that conversation of like, just talking about that and then being like in the conversation coming out like, yeah, we had all like thought about our server and like thought about like the hostess and like everybody who we met like while we were up there, and we're like, I wonder if they were working, and like to have that conversation with like an adolescent, that's gotta be
it's real. It's real stuff. I mean, like I still feel for my parents too a little bit, when 9/11 is brought up, I can still feel some kind of trauma that's still there that they went through. Because I mean, it wasn't just that day, but multiple days afterwards, every night we were on the phone with everybody from New York, like conference calls, talking about what was happening, talking about family, friends, talking, trying to figure out what was happening. And, I think they tried to shield me and my brother a bit from the most extreme details that they were dealing with people that they knew in the think But I remember stuff trickling in about, people losing dads and moms and, people never coming home. And it was tough. I think it was really tough on them. And it was, eye-opening experience for me as well. So yeah,
I remember
it's crazy, still crazy to think that it's 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, it's wild. I remember whatever that like first big movie came out about the 9/11 conspiracy.
Fahrenheit.
Fahrenheit.
Yeah. Well, Fahrenheit 9/11 is
no.
That's
much more.
It was
Loose Change.
It was the other one.
Loose
Change. Yeah,
Loose
I remember
Change.
watching that
Oh.
and talking to my dad about it, and it was one of the only times my dad was basically like, "No."
Like, just shut it down.
Stop.
No.
Yeah, my dad he's very just amazing as a father, and that was one of the only times. And I honestly think it had to do with the firefighters.
Oh yeah, right. That makes sense.
For listeners, my pops is a retired firefighter, and so I think he was basically like, "Shut this down."
Well, I'm glad that you brought up conspiracy theories because I was going to talk about what I was saying. Like there were some like formative moments, which are things like I was raised to be very anti-war, still am. I'm glad that I was. So like when the war, like the invasion of Afghanistan happened, like that was pretty immediate. Like this is not going to end well. And like I had some negative thought there, and then like I had like a conflicting. I remember this one commercial where it was like when they attacked the Twin. I don't think it was a commercial for anything. It was just paid by whatever, some probably political person.
Capitalism.
Yeah, and it was like when they attacked the Twin Towers, like they were trying to change America, and then like fades, and then it was because explosions, the towers, like also fucked up that they show that shit in like commercial, and then it like fades away. And then it fades back, and they're like, and they did, and it was just a row of houses with American flags on it. I remember having very conflicting feelings of being like,
I remember that commercial.
I think I remember that too,
yeah,
something similar,
yeah. And I remember being like, that's cool, but also we're not united because there's a bunch of racism happening against Muslim people. One, I remember this as being young, but like, are we united? And two, being like, this feels wrong, but also like, yeah, I want to have like a come together, and this was fucked up because it was later. It was like months later, I feel like, that this came out where like shit had happened. And I remember having really conflicting feelings at that point because like right after I was like a kid, and I was like, yeah, fuck these assholes. Like, this is terrible. This is fucked up, which it is. And yeah, like fuck those people who did that. But at the same, then as like the fallout started to happen, I remember being like, I don't know, this is the This is
Yeah,
what we want.
100% agree, Tyler. Yeah, it's hard to, in my memory, pinpoint exactly when the hyper nationalism started around it, and the really kind of, I would say, extreme anti-Muslim rhetoric started. But it wasn't long after, and it was pretty much a cornerstone for American politics for at least a decade after.
Well,
where
I would
9/11 was a rallying point. I mean, I think you can still kind of point to it. I think John was going to make that point, but it was definitely felt more extreme.
I would like to give George W. Bush some credit in this conversation, given his immediate reaction about Muslims. He went to a mosque like days after 9/11.
True.
Especially after what we've seen with Trump.
Yeah.
The Republican Party was primed to be so much fucking worse than it was. And George W. Bush deserves a lot of credit for making sure that did not happen until 2016.
Right. Yeah. I'll tip my hat as well. I think it's a good point, John. And plus I'll never forget when he threw out the first pitch in the World Series at Yankee Stadium.
Oh yeah, that's like, a pretty. I mean, a strike. Like, shut the fuck up. Yeah.
And listen, I would love. Let's get into this later. George W. Bush, under his presidency, some terrible things happened. But anyways, we can get into.
Yeah, we need to. Fluffy, tell us your wisdom.
Yeah, so my morning was interesting. I was downstairs getting ready for school. My sister yelled down the stairs that a plane had hit the World Trade Center, and I had no idea what that meant. And my dad, it was just like one of those, like, my dad was yelling back up the stairs, asking questions before he finally went into the living room and just turned on the TV.
Typical dad move.
So, yeah. And so he turned on the TV and was watching it. He initially was talking about like a small, like single engine plane. And then we started watching it. And I remember when we saw the first like replay of the fact that it was like a 747, my dad went, "This is terrorists." And like, I just remember him saying those words. I didn't know what they really meant, but I remember him like very clearly being like, "This is a terrorist attack." And so again, like, I feel like I was watching everybody else, and like I was watching what was happening, but couldn't comprehend fully what was happening. And then I walked to the middle school from my house growing up. So I went to one of my neighbor's house, JT's house, and to get him to walk to school. Well, his dad is an ATF agent.
That's right.
And so we're sitting and I didn't really like, here's how little I understood what was taking place. I went into the Petrelli's home, and they were eating breakfast and watching cartoons, and I didn't say anything. I was just like, I feel like they should, like, I just didn't know what to say. Like, I was so dumbfounded. And then all of a sudden his dad comes running down the stairs, with his cell phone going off, and he comes into the kitchen, he switches the television, and then like he's out the door.
Wow.
I was like, oh, okay. So like, this is like, people are doing things about this. That was when I was like, okay, so everybody's going to know what's going on with this.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, it was, other than that, it was just like my family, and my sister hollered down because she was listening to the radio. And then like the Petrellis didn't seem bothered by it. They were just watching cartoons. And then his dad comes down and was like, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway, so then I remember going in, again, it was a science class, must have been a 7th grade thing. I don't remember who my teacher was. She was the super hippie science teacher.
Ooh, I don't remember her name, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
What was her name? Started with an L. L something.
Yeah. It's probably good we're naming a bunch of people on our podcast that.
Yeah, this is probably great.
Yeah.
This is probably good.
Lincoln, maybe.
Lincoln.
Yeah, that sounds.
She was a great teacher. Shout out to Lincoln.
Yeah, she was a great teacher. But I just remember watching that in the first period, It's funny because you guys were talking about like later in the day. I remember that first period so clearly, and like maybe just snapshots the rest of the day.
Yeah, I have much clearer memories of the morning than I do. My last memory of the day is telling people at lunch that the largest federal center by square footage is in Denver, and so we better be ready. In retrospect, that being pretty funny because it's probably like.
I actually remember that phrase, John.
That
Do you?
phrase sticks out of my head too. I would be surprised you said that.
Does it really?
Out. You probably said it more than once, John.
Yeah.
And so
I'm sure.
like,
I'm sure I was telling everybody who I could
you
find
were spreading
who
that
wanted to
around
listen.
liberally to everybody who was within.
I was like, I know one fact about this shit, and I'm gonna make sure everybody knows it before they go home.
Well, you know, I mean, our bodies were highly activated. It's like we remember more in the morning. I think that makes sense because I'm sure it calmed down. But like, there's a collective thing that happens. Like we're queuing off of our adults and our parents, and they're probably like freaking either visibly or internally freaking the fuck out, and we are feeling that, and so we're getting like hyped up.
Totally.
And
think about our parents. They have we would probably be better equipped as a generation to deal with something like this with our children than our parents were because they didn't have an experience like this, right? And so I can't even fucking imagine, like we were talking about earlier, just like what do you do with that as an adult?
I was just thinking this, the amount of time that has come between the fall of the Berlin Wall. Oh, it's not quite right. It's 89. So it's like, but it's almost the fall of the Berlin Wall to 9/11 is like, we're not quite there, but that's almost, it's from 9/11 to now is almost double as much time. Not quite there yet. We got a couple years. But thinking about that, like that was like, because that was the year I was born.
Yeah, those were 12 years apart. We're 20
12 years apart. Yeah. So I was off by a few years. That's because I can't do the math. Because
all good.
It's okay.
Sorry.
But I think, okay, here, listen. It's double as much. It's the same amount of time between Bad Religion releasing their first EP and 9/11 as 9/11 and now. Okay, so fuck you, 1981. So
I like that math.
This is how we all mark time.
There we go. But I don't remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. Like, I was a baby, and I don't remember it as like a thing that like I remember happening and then affected my life, right? You know what I mean? And it's like 9/11 is that thing for me. That's like a big event like that, and I feel like the fall of the Berlin Wall is one of the biggest of our like parents' generation, right? Where like. And they were a little bit older at that point. They weren't like our age,
right?
And the vibe of it is the opposite, right?
Yeah.
That was about opening up to the world, because that's one of the biggest things we haven't really touched on yet. Like we talked about it a little bit, right? The terms of what happened over the next few days, how we felt over the next few days. But American society had a shift in their perspective on what was safe and what wasn't safe.
Oof.
And it was months and years after 9/11 that people were still dealing with that, right? It's like the South Park episode. You ever go back and watch the one Osama bin Laden has farty pants? And it's like they actually, if you guys don't know, go back and watch it, listeners, if you like South Park, because they aired that the week after 9/11 happened. And the boys at the beginning of it are standing there with trackers on their heads at the beginning of it, and they're checking them like getting on the bus, whether they have like weapons to get on the bus to go to school. Right. And like the idea of terrorism happening in the United States wasn't really on a lot of people's minds ever, except for like maybe security experts, people in the government might think about it. But it then became a maybe somewhat conflated reality for a lot of people, but certainly a reality for a lot of people who had never thought about it. Right. It changed the way people interacted with each other. It's changed how we went to the airport, changed how we went to sporting events, there was a lasting cognitive effect of it that I would say is still part of how the United States deals with people that are not American and the idea of foreigners. So,
and while not directly related to like Black Lives Matter or our current social justice movement, when there was like hey, white people are racist, I was like, yeah. Because like people were racist against Muslims. When this happened, and like I remember that, like hearing people say, it was a thing where we're like, not to say I had my own fucked up whiteness that happened, but I remember pretty quickly being like, yeah, like Americans are racist in a way that. So I feel like it has all of these ripple effects on so many different things that may not be directly related. But
just going to say, Tyler, it's interesting because I guess probably for most of the group, I feel I probably had a very different experience with the post 9/11 like feelings and emotions, because at that time, what I was surrounded by, was that like coming together, that like
America.
That commercial you talked about, like that's a time in my life where like that had choked me up, like.
Yeah, I'm more with you, Nelson. I look back on it now and realize the hypernationalism, but like with my parents being from New York, I was very much in the patriotism. Let's go, fuck shit up. Yeah.
The first goalie helmet I bought with my like rec pads was a USA flag helmet, and I bought that specifically because of 9/11. I remember specifically making that decision to be like, fuck yeah, let's go, when I saw that at the shop because of 9/11. So, and that was probably a year or two after 9/11, right?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't want to make myself sound like I definitely felt the patriotic feelings too. I think for me, that's the interesting part, is I felt a conflicted feeling. I felt the patriotism, but I also felt like something feels weird here. And I didn't figure that out. But I feel like, again, that's like for all of us, I feel like it sounds like we all had that at a certain point.
I know for sure by the 2004 election, I was like, this is a disaster. Yeah. This is warmongering bullshit. And we need to, like, this is an impeachable offense. Like, I was very, very, very adamant. But a year or two afterwards, I was like, this is, fucking America. Let's go. Yeah. And then, after the invasion of Iraq, it was that actually,
the invasion of Iraq changed everything. All of a sudden, that's when it turned for me too, where it was like, oh, this is no longer about stopping terrorism. This is blood oil.
And I think that's my clearest next memory in this context, actually, is I remember, because I'm almost positive the invasion happened that same week that we had that gigantic fucking snowstorm. And so I remember being in
you were
a Glenwood Springs hotel room because my parents had driven, and I were in Utah because it was spring break. We drove back for the end of the storm, and we got stuck in Glenwood Springs. We couldn't make it any further home. And I remember watching the beginning of the invasion on television that night. And so it's wild that like my next clear reaction or memory is that, instead of I remember feeling a lot of the like patriotic feelings and stuff like that, but that's my next clearest like current event memory.
Yeah. And
I remember the douchebags beating the Yankees in the World Series. I wasn't happy about that.
Sure, you
do. Does that count as current event?
Yeah. It does for you, for sure.
Yes. It's like when your dad went and played drums for like an hour, and then we came out and was like, I'm fine, totally good.
He did that a few times.
Yeah. And go Nelson. Yeah.
There's a lot of people that were. There's a lot of people in the United States that still were.
Totally.
Yeah. A lot of people we went to high school with. I remember.
Yeah. And to this day, I mean, there's a lot of people. But I think like it was that, and then like, definitely the invasion of Iraq, the next religion. I mean, and then as we got a little bit older, like when Loose Change came out, like, hey, listen, I've watched a lot of those things, and a lot of that shit gets debunked, but there are still certain things that are, I don't think our government necessarily did it. I do think, though, that there are unanswered questions that they fucking know. They're just not going to tell us, because they don't tell us everything. Why would they tell us everything?
I think it is fucking preposterous to think that the United States government was involved in that, especially at the top levels. I think that is fucking an insane thing to think in the face of.
Nobody can keep a secret for fucking.
Are you
anything.
fucking kidding me?
How are we gonna
Are you?
I've worked in local government. Nobody's
that competent, and nobody can keep fucking secrets.
No.
Now, Do I think that there are things about that day that we still do not officially know for sure? Because that's how the historic record works, right? Like we will find things out in 50 years that we didn't know on that day. And probably a lot of it is like, we couldn't tell you because that would give up a source or method that is still active. And so we would get that person killed if we told you this information. And so we can't do it. So I don't even want to say it's quote unquote malicious that we don't know about, and you might interpret it that way, but I think the people making the counter argument would say it's not malicious. It's to protect American security and our sources and methods. So I think all of that just gets us further away from solving actual problems.
Yeah, I mean, like, not only is it possible that there are probable that there are people that are open investigations, but also in a time like this, the government is supposed to be like, hey, everybody, we got this. Because we're going to be okay, because that's how governments operate. Because if not, people are going to lose their minds. And so what governments do is go, hey, we got this. And if they made mistakes, that's what I think. I also think that they made some mistakes at relatively high levels. I think some mistakes were made. And I think that they didn't want people to know that, because for obvious reasons, they wanted a sense of unity and safety, you know? And like, I'm just like, yeah, that's life.
Yeah, and that's also like leadership 101, right? Is like, even if you're panicking, don't show them that you're panicking.
Yeah. Totally,
so
totally.
Yeah.
Also, they wanted to invade Iraq, so I think there were certain.
Also, they wanted to invade Iraq. Like let's be very clear about like that's the actual conspiracy, right? Like that's one of the things that fucking drives me nuts about conspiracy theories generally is. Nobody actually pays attention to the real fucking conspiracies because they're not as sexy. Turns out the mystery is what's sexy, not the like actual event. Because
Mr. Powell, I'm going to ask you right now: do they have weapons of mass destruction?
Yes, is basically what he said.
Yes, we believe they have mass destruction. So we should go in there.
That's a fucking conspiracy, and it led us into one of the most, if not the most disastrous foreign policy adventure this country's ever been on. It probably led to a whole bunch of shit like Trump even. I mean, that is, and I will say
already unstable
whole fucking nightmare.
To a point that, it's a fucking,
And I want to make sure we get this in on this discussion. There is an alternative history, even with George Bush as president, where we didn't view this as an act of war. And I think it would have been so much better for this country if we had had strong enough and clear enough leadership. Like, I think H.W. Bush might have been able to do this.
Yeah, Clinton might have been able to do it too if he was still.
And explain to the American people that this is a horrific event that will be answered, but it will not be answered with full American military might. We will take care of the bad guys for sure. But the way we're like, the thing that really sticks with me when we went to fucking Peace Jam, Tyler, and that the lady there. Oh, sorry, Kelly, the Iranian lady, I forget her name, who said the best way America could have responded to 9/11 is to go into Afghanistan and build a school in the name of every victim of 9/11.
Yeah.
And like,
and there's hospitals.
And there's some practical stuff of like, oh, well, you know, how are you going to do that if the Taliban's shooting at you? It's like, I agree. And that's why we should have some military presence, but we should take the Defense Department budget and the State Department budget and flip them. That is the effective response to 9/11. And it wouldn't domestically, we got into this whole security posture that has been disastrous for personal freedom. It is continuing to get worse and worse and worse.
Jesus
we
Christ.
have the militarization of the American police forces is directly related to 9/11 and military expenditures. And so the
creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which is where ICE comes from, is directly related to 9/11.
And so we didn't have to do that because, as we've seen, we haven't had another terrorist attack on American soil to that size. And I don't think it's because we invaded fucking Iraq. And so I think the single biggest failure of the Bush administration, on top of, I'm talking including the Great Recession, I'm talking about Katrina, I'm talking about the war in Iraq. The single biggest failure of his administration was to fail to respond to 9/11 in the appropriate manner, which would have been in a civic way and not a military way. And I think that the time it's hard for me to even think about the counterfactual because it makes me so fucking upset.
And who knows? You can't play the counterfactual history game all day. I know it's frustrating, but we have the facts we have.
I almost wanted you to Godspeed on the end of that, but I also wanted to say because I think it's just important to mention.
I'm all fired up now.
Yeah, that, and this is like now I feel like you know I want to make a philosophical point in that like true leaders respond to situations not based on what their motive is, but on taking in, I mean, sure, their own agenda, but also the whole landscape of what's going on, right? You have to consider what you're doing. The Wolfowitz Doctrine, which was leaked in 1992, which was intended for the fiscal years of 1994 to 1999, specifically says within it that what they need to happen is for a plan that they have in place, as I mentioned, is something
precipitating event,
and they say something like that, and then it says the size of Pearl Harbor or like the magnitude of Pearl Harbor. And then it starts to lay out the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran, I believe, for the use of building a pipeline and various extraction of resources.
Yeah.
And what Paul Wolfowitz, for those who don't know, was in the administration. Dick Cheney was, I think, signed on to this. A few other players, I think, who were in the administration. And so when this happened, this apparently appears to be what they were trying to enact. Right. So they had their own fucking ideas. And, you know, Dick Cheney, terrible intentions, just that dude alone. And so, you know, we see the fallout now of what has happened because these leaders were incompetent.
So it's funny. I know I've referenced this before. My capstone history class was compare and contrast the wars in Afghanistan, Vietnam, and Iraq. And so we had to write like 6 or 7 papers in that class, just like kind of editorials almost. And one of them was, why did we invade Iraq? That's it. That was the question. Yeah.
Was the Wolfowitz Doctrine?
Well, so I started writing it. I had to stop and start writing it like 2 or 3 times at least because I was so fucking mad when I was writing it. I would just start like diatribing and then be like, this is not a
rant.
Paper.
This is no longer
this is not a delete, start over again. And so what I found, I encountered similar things, and I think it is a little bit too simple to say it was about oil, quote unquote.
That's true.
That's true. But oil
about bigger
is
geopolitical moves, but it's too much to get into at the end.
But it is about oil. It's kind of like Civil War was about slavery. It wasn't about slavery, but ultimately, really, it was just about slavery.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way about Iraq. If I remember correctly, if you really like dig into the Wolfowitz Doctrine, it is okay. America is a hegemon. We are the single superpower. How do we continue to be the single superpower? Well, we make sure that no power becomes a regional power that can then become a global power. And how do powers become regional powers that become global powers? They control specific strategic resources.
Uh-huh.
And so I think the invasion of Iraq was about putting away a rival to America before they became a rival. We forget in 1993, Iraq had the third largest army in the world. And so,
John, do you really are we going to sit here and talk Middle Eastern history right now? Because I mean, I've got a bunch of stuff to say about this because you can argue that Saddam wasn't even that much of a strategic piece when you looked at how he was wedged into the geopolitics of the Middle East anyway, that the Wolfowitz Doctrine fucked up their initial assumptions about what the Middle East was and who were the important power players there.
Well, I don't think sure, like, but that doesn't. I don't think that says anything. That just says they were wrong in their assessment, not that wasn't the reason why they invaded, right? Like
sure.
So
I've
I think
heard Iran was the real target.
Exactly. I mean, it's about controlling a strategic resource, which is not necessarily well distributed among borders, right? Yeah. So, we don't need to do 20 rounds on this right now. We can save that for our upcoming podcast.
Yeah, it'll be titled "Why Did We Invade Iraq?"
It'll be a 12-part series. Each episode will be 3.5 hours long, and you're welcome, listeners.
And we'll start each
Yeah.
one by reading John's essay that he wrote in whatever grade.
Oh my god, I wonder if I could find that. It's probably on some hard drive I have somewhere.
Yeah,
It's
Find it.
probably
We could post
such
it.
garbage.
So
listeners-
tough to go back and read old stuff.
Post some comments about what you think about what you remember about that.
We would
day.
love to hear your stories as well. One of the, us having a historical mindset on this, one of the things we want to do is make sure we just got our recollections on tape. Some poor grad student in the future might be listening to this and, making it part of one of his papers or whatever. And so these types of things end up becoming important. It's something I personally find important, is that we record these things, because I think we can, the future generations can learn from us. So please impart your wisdom, folks, and Godspeed.
Yeah, this one's one for the time capsule.
Yeah,
It is one for the
Shablam.
time capsule.
100%.